They told us Dogman was just a legend, a story meant to scare kids into staying out of the forest, but the night the howls circled our cabin and the shadows began moving on two legs, we realized legends don't leave footprints in fresh snow or breathe hot against your neck. If you want to know what truly hunted us deep in the Appalachian wilderness and how only one of us made it out alive, subscribe now. Because this story only gets darker from here. We never planned to stay past sunset, not in those mountains, not after what the old ranger told us, but when the storm rolled in like a living wall of black cloud and shattered the sky with thunder. Our narrow dirt road vanished beneath mud and fallen trees, forcing us to seek shelter in an abandoned hunting cabin that smelled of rust, mildew, and something faintly metallic. And as we barricaded the rotting door with broken furniture and waited for the rain to pass, none of us noticed the claw marks carved into the beams or the strange symbols etched into the floorboards. Warnings left behind by people who clearly hadn't survived long enough to tell their story, and as the night deepened, the forest outside began to change. The normal sounds of insects and owls fading into an oppressive silence that made every breath echo like a gunshot, until suddenly a howl tore through the darkness, low, long, and layered with multiple tones that vibrated inside our bones rather than our ears, freezing us in place. Its instinct screamed that whatever made that sound was not a wolf, not a bear, and definitely not human. And when another howl answered it from closer range, we realized we were surrounded, the sound bouncing from ridge to ridge as if something massive were circling, testing, hunting, and then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, two-legged, pacing around the cabin while claws scraped across the logs, leaving grooves so deep the wood curled outward, and as panic swallowed us whole, we began to see movement through the cracked windows, towering shadows, hunched shoulders, elongated snouts, and eyes that glowed faint amber, watching, calculating, waiting for weakness. And when the door shuddered under a sudden impact powerful enough to crack the frame, one of us, Ryan, whispered that he could smell it. A stench like wet fur and blood and iron, and before we could respond, the back wall exploded inward as something massive slammed through the rotten planks, splintering them like matchsticks, revealing a towering creature at least 8 feet tall. Its body covered in matted dark fur, its legs bent backward like a wolf's, its arms long and corded with muscle, ending in claws that curved like butcher knives, and its face, that face, was the most horrifying thing I have ever seen. A twisted fusion of wolf and man, with intelligent eyes that reflected our terror, and as it roared, the sound seemed to crush the air itself, knocking us backward, and chaos erupted as we scattered, screaming, tripping, scrambling through debris while the creature lunged, swiping Ryan across the chest and sending him crashing into the far wall, his flashlight spinning uselessly across the floor as blood darkened his jacket. And while 2 of us dragged him toward the trapdoor beneath the rug, hoping the cramped crawl space might hide us, another howl echoed from outside, followed by more footsteps. Confirming our worst fear, it wasn't alone, and as we dropped into the darkness below the cabin, sealing the hatch just as claws slashed through the space where our heads had been seconds before, the air below filled with the sound of frantic breathing, muffled sobs, and the faint scratching overhead, relentless, patient, as though the creatures knew time was on their side. And in that suffocating darkness, Ryan whispered something that made my blood turn to ice, that he had seen these things before, years ago, when his brother vanished during a camping trip in the same mountains, and that what hunted us wasn't just an animal, but something ancient, territorial, and intelligent enough to remember faces. And as the scratching above suddenly stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even more terrifying, we realized the worst truth of all: they weren't trying to break in anymore. Because they had already found another way inside. The emergency lights pulsed like a dying heartbeat, bathing the cavern in blood-red shadows as distant alarms wailed through corroded speakers, their distorted echoes bouncing endlessly through the tunnel network. And for a brief, terrifying moment we stood frozen, realizing something ancient had just been awakened. Then instinct took over and we ran, weaving between overturned gurneys, shattered glass tanks, and rusted surgical instruments scattered across the floor like relics of forgotten torture, while the air vibrated with approaching footsteps, heavy, coordinated, relentless, and as we burst through a reinforced steel door hanging crooked on broken hinges, we entered what had once been the heart of the facility, a massive underground lab carved directly into the mountain. Its walls lined with cracked observation windows revealing sealed chambers filled with murky fluid, some still containing vague humanoid shapes suspended inside, frozen mid-transformation. Their elongated limbs and distorted skulls visible beneath the cloudy liquid, and the sight shattered any lingering hope that the Dogmen were merely animals. Confirming instead that they were victims, and monsters, created through grotesque human ambition, and as we stumbled deeper, we discovered computer terminals still faintly humming. Powered by some hidden generator that had miraculously survived decades, and when we activated one, fragmented logs began scrolling across the flickering screen, revealing that Project Legion had been designed not just to enhance soldiers, but to create self-sustaining biological weapons capable of adapting to any environment, hunting autonomously, and reproducing, and the final entries spoke of catastrophic containment failure, internal sabotage, and a desperate evacuation after several subjects demonstrated advanced intelligence, coordinated pack behavior, and the ability to mimic limited human speech, and before we could absorb the full horror of that revelation, a voice echoed through the chamber, low, distorted, and unmistakably human, calling out a single word, brother, and we turned to see the scarred Alpha Dogman standing atop a collapsed observation platform. Its massive chest rising and falling as its eyes locked onto us with unmistakable recognition, and for one impossible moment, the creature seemed to hesitate, its posture conflicted, torn between predatory instinct and fading memory. And then the hesitation vanished as something behind us exploded, sending a wave of heat and debris tearing through the room, knocking us flat as another pack member smashed through a reinforced door, forcing the Alpha to unleash a bone-rattling roar that triggered a coordinated assault, and chaos erupted as we sprinted through a maze of corridors while clawed limbs tore chunks from the walls and jaws snapped inches from our heads. The tunnels narrowing and widening unpredictably, funneling us into dead ends and forcing desperate detours. Until we stumbled into a massive chamber dominated by a subterranean river plunging into a roaring waterfall that disappeared into a bottomless abyss, and as we skidded to a halt at the edge, the creatures emerged behind us, forming a tightening semicircle, their glowing eyes reflecting in the churning black water, and with nowhere left to run, we prepared for the inevitable, when suddenly the Alpha stepped forward again, raising one clawed hand, causing the others to freeze, and in a chilling display of retained humanity, it staggered toward us, its massive form trembling, before reaching into a torn satchel strapped to its chest and withdrawing a weathered photograph, a faded image of two teenage boys standing at the edge of a forest trail, arms slung around each other's shoulders, Ryan and his brother. And the creature released a broken, guttural sound that might once have been a sob, and in that moment we understood that beneath the fur and fangs, fragments of human identity still remained, trapped inside an unending nightmare. And that fleeting hesitation gave us our only chance, as a tremor rippled through the chamber, followed by a deafening explosion from deep within the facility, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction that sent sections of the cavern collapsing inward, forcing the pack to retreat as massive slabs of rock crashed between us, and without thinking, we dove into the freezing torrent, allowing the violent current to rip us from the jaws of death, dragging us through submerged tunnels, razor-sharp rocks tearing at our skin as darkness swallowed us whole, and just when our lungs felt ready to burst, we were violently expelled from the mountain's mouth, tumbling into an icy river far below, coughing, bleeding, and barely alive, and as dawn crept over the misty tree line, we staggered onto the riverbank, shattered and half delirious, convinced we had escaped, until a distant howl rolled across the mountains, answered by another, and another. And we realized the nightmare had not ended, it had only been unleashed. The river carried us miles downstream before exhaustion finally dragged us onto a gravel bank just as the sun rose weakly through dense fog, painting the forest in pale gray shadows that made every tree look like a lurking figure, and for a brief moment we believed we had escaped, but the silence that followed was wrong, too heavy, too intentional. And as we staggered through the brush searching for a road, the distant thump of helicopter blades shattered the morning calm, followed by black military aircraft emerging from the cloud cover like predatory birds. Their searchlights cutting through the forest canopy as armored vehicles thundered along unseen roads, converging on our location with terrifying precision, and before we could run, armed soldiers in unmarked tactical gear surrounded us. Their weapons trained steadily on our heads, their faces hidden behind dark visors, and without explanation we were bound, hooded, and transported to a remote underground facility where hours of brutal interrogation followed. The same questions repeated endlessly: what did you see, how many were there, did any escape? And when our answers matched their classified files too closely, their demeanor shifted from disbelief to cold calculation, revealing that the government had always known the creatures survived, monitoring the Appalachian region for decades, quietly erasing disappearances, falsifying reports, and silencing witnesses, and when we demanded answers, a senior officer finally confessed that Project Leakin had never truly ended, that fragments of its research continued under different names, different budgets, different shadows, all driven by the same obsession, to control what they had created, and that the creatures we encountered were only one pack among several scattered across remote wilderness zones. Their populations carefully managed through covert extermination operations, except the Appalachia pack had proven uniquely intelligent, evasive, and lethal, and our survival would now expose their existence, making us liabilities. And as the word containment lingered ominously in the air, we realized execution was the simplest solution, until a violent alarm interrupted the chamber, signaling a breach, followed by distant gunfire, screams, and the unmistakable echo of howls reverberating through steel corridors, and in that moment, terror gave way to incomprehensible dread. They had followed us, tracking our scent across rivers, mountains, and concrete, hunting with a patience that defied logic, and as chaos erupted, doors were ripped from hinges, lights exploded overhead, and soldiers were torn apart in flashes of blood and shadow, while we fled through emergency corridors, guided only by flickering exit signs and instinct, eventually bursting into open air as the facility detonated behind us in a blinding fireball that shook the earth itself. And as we ran through the forest one final time, we felt their presence all around us, unseen eyes watching, guiding, hurting, until we reached the edge of a highway where passing drivers finally noticed our desperate signals and brought help, yet even as ambulances carried us away, we could see movement in the tree line, towering silhouettes retreating silently back into the mountains, their mission complete, their warning delivered. And in the months that followed, official reports labeled the incident a gas explosion. The missing soldiers declared casualties of a classified training accident, and our testimony dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations, but I still wake every night drenched in sweat, hearing those howls echo through my dreams. Because deep down I know the truth, they let us live, not out of mercy, but so the story would spread, so the fear would travel, so humans would remember that the forests are not ours. That something ancient and engineered now walks those ridgelines, guarding its territory with blood and bone, and if you ever find yourself deep in the Appalachian wilderness and hear a howl that sounds almost human, don't run, don't scream, and don't look back, because by then, it's already too late.